Hi, it's Jessi. Today I am drinking Fujian oolong tea from Bare Leafs. It's the same day as the rest of my wrap-up videos, which is why I'm in the same sweater, but it's later. So I've gotten new tea and my lipstick's gone, and I changed my slippers, not that you can see my feet to know that, so yeah, it's been a long day. So today's video, I was gonna do a worst reads or least favorite of 2020 video, and I just kind of decided, one, I didn't have enough to say about those books to really justify a whole video, and honestly we don't need that negativity. So I'm gonna very quickly go through my 5 least favorite books that I read this year, just kind of quickly say why, and then we're gonna move on to the positives and talk about my favorites. So just very quickly, the only one of these that is a DNF, because I wasn't gonna include DNFs in this, is The Lonely Hearts Hotel, because I hated every minute I spent reading this, and it took me so long to actually get to convince myself to DNF it. One, because it was early in the year and I was kind of only just starting to accept that sometimes you just gotta put a book down, and also I just kept expecting it to get good and it just never did. I wish I had never read it. Anyway, so that's why that's there. But let's move on to my actual least favorite reads of the year that I actually finished in no particular order. Honestly, I think these are in order from when I read them most recently. The least recently is I think the order they ended up in. But the first of these, The Eyes of the World by Harold Bell Wright. I read this for my reading books with the same title as Wheel of Time books video. You should check it. You should check it out. It's really enjoyable. Or enjoyable to watch, not enjoyable to have experienced. And this was one of the reasons why. This book was just nothing worth reading. It was misogynistic, it was sexist, it was a little bit classist, a lot of bit classist, and it was arrogant, and just, I didn't enjoy it. Next to The Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. I want to give Lovecraft a shot. People seem to like him. He's a classic for a reason, but I don't see why. The racism, the classism, horror, absolutely rampant in the book. And the thing is, the horror itself wasn't even that scary. He has a way of describing things, which I think most people are probably familiar with, where it's really vague, and I hate it. I don't know. Telling me other people are scared of something doesn't mean I'm going to be scared of it. It was classist and racist, and it wasn't good enough to justify it. I can complain about Tolkien being misogynist, but at least I see the appeal of his books. I just didn't even see the appeal, but it's one book. I'll probably give him another chance, and he'll probably be on my worst books of 2021 list. So specifically, of all of them, Inheritance by Christopher Paolini. I didn't like anything from the Inheritance cycle, which I hate because I know people love it, and I hate not liking things people love. But of all of them, Inheritance was the worst. And honestly, I couldn't tell you now why, but the Inheritance cycle in general is just it's very derivative, which is fine. The fantasy series genre borrows from each other itself all the time. But it wasn't done well. It was cringy. And I feel bad saying that because I know a kid wrote it, a literal kid wrote it, but it was cringy, and I don't think you can just brush that under the rug because, oh, he was just a little boy. Yeah, it just, God, and the whole fair folk exotic beauty thing just really, then The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I actually still own this one. This is one of the few physical books I'll hold up during this video. It's really shiny and the light's kind of reflecting on it weird. I planned fully on unhauling this, finding a place to donate it or sell it, but at the moment I still have it. I didn't enjoy reading this, and not just because it was hard to read. I thought it talked down to the audience, and I know it's a middle grade, it's for children, but it felt like it was talking down to even that age range. And having spoken with several people since then, John Boyne is even worse than I thought. He was he came out very supportive of J.K. Rowling this year, which I didn't know when I read this, and the other things I didn't know is just like how little research he did for this, and why like part of why it's so inaccurate and poorly done is because he didn't bother to do research about the Holocaust before writing a book about the Holocaust. So, you know, it was bad to start off, and the more I learned about it, the worse it got. And last, if I've been counting correctly, is Cocoa Beach by Beatrice Williams. Ugh, this bored me. I think to me one of the worst sins a book can do for me is just bore me, and Cocoa Beach bored me. It bored me to tears. So, all right, so that's enough of the bad stuff. Let's get to the good stuff. So what I'm doing here specifically, because I read a lot of fantasy this year, and fantasy is traditionally my favorite genre. And I didn't want to do like, oh, here are my top 10 books and 8 of the 10 are all fantasy. So instead of doing that, what I'm doing is breaking this down and doing favorites by genre. If you're interested in my thoughts on the fantasy that I read, go ahead, check my ranking every fantasy book I read in 2020 video, because that's where I talk about the fantasy, and anything that's in the top tier is high praise, highly recommend it, would suggest it for everyone. Just beautiful books. So moving on from that, we're gonna go genre by genre. I have these ordered by the number of books I've read in that genre. Some of these are gonna have 2 books because it's my thing, I can make it up. If there are 2 books in this genre I think everybody should read, then that's what I'm gonna do. And that's kind of what I'm going with here. My personal enjoyment, but also books I think everybody would enjoy reading, or maybe not everybody, but most people. So consider this my recommendations by genre or something like that, if it makes it easier for you to swallow the fact that not all of these are only going to have 1. So anyway, starting with the book I read the least of, which was nonfiction. I only read 7 nonfictions this year, but despite that I have 2 I'm going to put in here. One will be The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. I read this really close to the beginning of the year. I actually read this when the pandemic was starting, and my partner and I were both working from home, and we were listening to a lot of audiobooks together. And this was one we listened to, and I loved it. This is about it's not about Jack the Ripper. It's about the women that were killed by Jack the Ripper. And it just takes this really interesting perspective on so many different things. I mean, a lot of it is just talking about what life was like in that time period. What was this, the mid-19th century, I think? For middle class to lower class women, working class women. And what life was really like for them. And that's what a lot of this was, because it's like taking a look at these women's lives. Not their deaths, their lives. But the other thing that this does is really examine why people are so fascinated by Jack the Ripper and why that's maybe problematic. And I just thought it was really good. The other nonfiction I read this year that I absolutely loved was Becoming by Michelle Obama. I think a lot of people read this and a lot of people love this. I just thought it was wonderful. I don't normally read memoirs. Well, here's the thing. I don't read a lot of nonfiction to start with. So I can't even be like, well, I don't really like memoirs. And this was the exception, because it's not like I read a lot of memoirs to start with. But I just really was fascinating learning more about her, more about her life. Honestly, the stuff I loved the most was just her life. Not getting into the politics, not even getting into Barack, or I just liked hearing about her life. So maybe I do like memoirs, I don't know. Next, for graphic novels, I read 10 graphic novels this year. So I'm gonna, again, do 2 here, but one's kind of an honorable mention. The honorable mention here is On a Sunbeam by Tilly Walden. I adored On a Sunbeam. I want to, if I can get a hold of it, because I checked it out from the school library and I don't work there anymore. I would like to reread it, because looking at the reviews after I read it, a lot of them talked about all the symbolism in the pictures and the colors, which I didn't pick up on because honestly, I'm a terrible graphic novel reader and mostly just look at the dialogue. So that's something I want to do. The other is the Lock and Key series. I'm not going to pick out a favorite one of these books because it's been way too long since I read them for me to be like, this is the one I loved the most, because all but one of them got 5 stars, so I can't even like look. But these are really good. I have a review for them, and I have a commentary on like how terrible the Netflix adaptation was. I don't know how good either one of those videos are now, because that was a long time ago, but I'm not gonna sit here and talk about Lock and Key too much. I just absolutely adored, and I mean adored, the characters. I was rooting for them so hard that, I mean, I was feeling fear for them in a way that, like, I don't expect to feel fear ever when I read books, let alone graphic novels where you kind of can see what's coming. So it was really well done, and screw Netflix for watering it down to make it, I don't know why they watered it down. So moving on to historical fiction, surprisingly I read 11 books in this category, and my favorite for this is definitely The Map of Lost Memories by Kim Fay. This is an adventure book, it's been a while since I read this, about a young woman looking for like lost treasure. And the reason that this makes my top list for historical fiction is just how well done the commentary on treasure hunting was, about whom artifacts belong to, and it was just so well done. I just wish it had been gayer. Like, that's been, I think, my review for that every time was, wow, this was really good, a lot of commentary I wasn't expecting. Why is it so straight? All right, moving on to contemporaries. Once again, I'm gonna have two here that are about very similar topics, but from very different, well, no, they're not about similar topics at all. I mean, they're about race, but not at all about the same things involving race. The first of these, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I fully believe this is going to be taught in schools one day. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be. So this is about a young black woman who goes to a party and is driving home with a friend, and they get pulled over and her friend gets shot by a cop. I would recommend looking up trigger warnings for this if you're gonna read it. Obviously a lot of racism, microaggressions get addressed in it a lot, and it was just really powerful to read. I also read it in the middle of summer when everything was happening with Black Lives Matter. Still is happening, just more quietly. And so it was just a really interesting time to be reading it, to be honest, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot, and I think it's really important read, and I do think it's going to be taught. I would not be surprised if by the time I have kids, they're reading this in 5th or 6th, excuse me, in like 7th or 8th grade. The other one here, also about race, but on the other side of things, nope, that's not right. But more within the community, although there's some of that. And anyway, Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. This is about a boy whose brother gets shot, and he decides he's going to do the right thing, quote unquote right thing, for what he's supposed to do and get revenge. This is just, it's told in verse. I did the audiobook and it was beautifully done, beautifully read, beautifully performed, beautifully written. I just kind of wish it had been longer so I could have gotten a little more out of it, but I loved it. I think it's such a good book, and I think it's such an important one. But I also fully acknowledge that this book is not for me. It wasn't written for me. And I still got a lot out of it, but I do think I'm not the target audience for this for a lot of reasons. But I do think it's important, and it was very well written. I feel like before I go on that most of my categories here are based off of either what like Storygraphs labeled it as or what Goodreads labeled it as. A few of these are ones I personally put there. So when I say I read 14 mysteries this year, I'm not entirely sure where those come from, because I don't think I read 14 mysteries this year. But anyway, the top one of this is easy for me, and it's also the reason all my wrap-up videos are coming out in January instead of December, because I would have hated the idea of reading the best book of 2020 and having to talk about it at the end of 2021 because I did my wrap-up too soon. And that ended up kind of happening. So my favorite mystery was so clearly, easily to me, Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. I do have, so I bought and read earlier in this year, And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer by Frederick Bachman. And I thought it was good. It wasn't like an instant favorite. It did make me a little misty-eyed. There's something spilled on this. I don't know. And I enjoyed it. But it didn't make me want to like run out and read a bunch of Frederick Bachman books. And Anxious People didn't sound like something I would like. So it's described as a book about a bank robbery gone wrong or something like that. And it just didn't sound like something that was going to be for me. But, names. But Leslie, on her Discord server, which she now shares with another podcast, was reading it for their monthly buddy read. They decided to start one. Start a book club. And I decided, you know what, might as well join in. So I got the ebook, or the audiobook. I got the audiobook. And it crushed me. Like, it was so impactful, and I'm just not going to talk about it that much. I went on about it for a long time in my December wrap up if you're interested in more of my thoughts, but it just crushed me. Like, it was good. It was really good, and every time I talk about it, I get a little bit teary-eyed because that book got me, you know? So moving into the horror and thriller category, I have two things here that are very different kinds of horrors. So the more classic, scary, bump in the night horror that's on here is Nosferatu by Joe Hill. This was really good. I don't think it would, if I wasn't doing this by genre, I don't think it would have been on my favorite books of the year list. However, I do think as far as horror goes, it was probably one of my favorite horrors I've ever read. I read several horror and thriller books. I kind of grouped them here because I don't really know where the line is. I think horror is like thriller but with fantastic elements. I don't know. But I just don't know if it's actually the genre for me. I keep trying it and I keep being disappointed. This was the first one that I think, outside of, I guess, Lock and Key technically, that just straight up didn't disappoint. And it was good. But the one I actually really want to talk about here, which maybe Nosferatu you could call an honorable mention here, because the one that's very clearly my favorite, I just don't know if horror or thriller or horror is the best genre to put it in, is Kingdom of Needle and Bone by Mira Grant. Shauna Maguire, I almost said Shauna Maguire there, they're the same person. Anyway, this is not a book I would recommend to almost anyone right now, but this is about a pandemic breaking out. It's like a different form of measles, and it gets contained. A lot of the population dies off, and it's mostly contained, but it turns out that even if you live from this, it really decimates your immune system, and it's just awful. And it's about not so much the pandemic itself, it's more the after effects of the pandemic. And it was hard to read, but I'm glad I did. I think it's a lot more about the people than it is necessarily about the pandemic. It's about how people respond to it. It's about the politics of it. It's about why aren't we doing more? Why are we doing so much? It's interesting, and it's a lot of it about where do you draw the line? When do you take matters into your own hands? Who do you blame? So I think it's really interesting, and I think I really enjoyed reading it. I would not recommend it for a lot of people right now, because I fully acknowledge that for a lot of people right now, reading about that would be very difficult. And for many people, it probably will always be difficult to read about something like that. But if you feel like you're in a mental state where you can handle it, I would fully recommend this book. So for classics, I read 16 classics this year, which is actually pretty good. I think I would like it to be a little bit higher considering the number of books overall I read, but on an average year, 16 classics is really good. My favorite for this would be The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I really love this. I don't know that I have a lot to say about it, to be honest. This is about, what was the name of the character? I can't remember the name. Celie. This is about Celie, who's writing letters to God, and then it goes from there. It's an Episcopalian, I don't know the name of the word. It starts with an E. Episcopar. It's told through letters. And it's really interesting, and it explores a lot of very deep topics. It explores our relationship, specifically Celie's relationship, but in general, relationship to God, specifically the relationship people of color have had to God because of various things, largely tied to colonialism and slavery. There's a really interesting exploration there. There are some flaws. I do think the criticism of missionaries wasn't quite strong enough, but I think it was really good, and I think it's one, if you need a classic to read this one. There's actually another thing I'm going to mention in a minute, but read this one. So moving on to science fiction, I read 17 science fiction novels this year, which is kind of low, but I don't really care for science fiction. And my favorite one this year was obviously Ready Player One by, I was gonna see how long I could go with that joke, but no, I can't do it. Anyway, my actual favorites that I read this year, one is Middle Game by Shauna McGuire, which I've seen people classify it more as fantasy than sci-fi, but I definitely think it's sci-fi. So it's alchemy, and alchemy kind of like occupies that weird in-between space, but this is like, if you have sci-fantasy, there's stuff that's more the fantasy side of it and stuff that's more the science, and I definitely think this is, anyway, I'm calling it sci-fi. Deal with it. I loved it. I mean, it's about this alchemist who wants to get to the impossible city, which is like an allegory or for Oz, or what are some, Avalon, or I feel like I should know more fantastical cities than just those two, but you know what I mean. And in order to do it, he starts making human embodiments of the doctrine. And he finds that to get where the story starts, it's just that he finds that the doctrine, which is like the code of the universe, has to be split in two in order for a human to survive or this personification to survive having it. It's just really interesting. So there's a lot of weird twin stuff going on in it, and it's just so good. It starts with, okay, I am a sucker for a good first line. So like the first line of the 5th season for N.K. Jemisin's The Broken Earth starts with, "This is how the world ends." Beautiful. Literally the first line of Shauna McGuire's Middle Game is, "There is so much blood." And it's just, actually, if you go back even further than that, like tag for the chapter or whatever is timeline 5 minutes too late, 30 seconds from the end of the world. Oh, sorry. Failure, timeline 5 minutes too late, 30 seconds from the end of the world. There is so much blood. Like, I don't know, that just hooks you in, and I feel like that kind of tells you a lot about what this book is. It's weird. It's probably not for everyone, because not everybody's gonna like this weird, wacky, makes you feel stupid thing, but I love weird, wacky, makes you feel stupid books. Also for sci-fi, the other one I'm going to mention is just Frankenstein. This could have gone in classics too, so I'm okay including a second one because it's really just half in 2 categories. It's good. I won't belabor talking about Frankenstein too much because, well, it's Frankenstein. But it's good, and the commentary is good. The language is definitely hard, like more so than like The Color Purple was. The language for Frankenstein is definitely difficult. I really struggled with it, but I also, when I did understand what was happening, I had so many lines that were highlighted because they were just so well done. Yeah, this is literally from her author's note. "I felt that blank incapacity of invention, which is the greatest misery of authorship, when dull nothing replies to our anxious invocations." Like, what a beautiful way to describe just writer's block. So anyway, I enjoyed reading this. I think it was profound. I thought it was beautifully written. I think it's really clever. I think it says a lot about the nature of mankind, and it does. No, and it doesn't even do that. I was gonna say it falls into the sci-fi, ooh, science bad, scary, but it doesn't, because the reason that I normally think sci-fi is bad and how it portrays science is because it ignores the kind of procedures we have in place to ensure those things don't happen. But I actually think this avoids that insofar as the guy isn't actually a scientist. Get out of here, Victor. Anyway, read Frankenstein if you haven't. Honestly, I would put The Color Purple ahead of Frankenstein if you like need to pick a classic to read, but Frankenstein would be a close second. So going on to romance, which for some reason is my second most read genre with 23. Don't know how that happened. Two of these to suggest. One is Ella Enchanted. Neither one of these are primarily a romance. Well, they are. They're primarily love stories, but they're told in a totally different or interesting way. One is Ella Enchanted. You're familiar with the premise of this story if you've seen the movie, but you're definitely not familiar with the story if you've seen the movie. It's just a cute story about discovering independence and finding yourself. And it really, the actual romance in it is so secondary. Similarly, actually not at all similar, This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This definitely falls into the written really confusing and it made me feel stupid category. But it's just this beautiful story. This is about two agents on opposite sides of a war throughout time. And they start communicating with each other, starting with taunts and then maybe something more. And I just found myself so sucked in by the prose. I'm a sucker for beautiful prose. There's a reason I love Night Circus so much. Starless Sea less so. I mean, I still love it, but not as much. And it's just absolutely beautifully flowery and almost pretentious. And my battery's about to die, so we're gonna skip right quick to the end. And the last one on this list here for fantasy, I mean, like I said, check out the ranking video if you haven't already. I would do honorable mentions, but it's really not worth it. But my actual favorite book that I read in 2020, period, but definitely my favorite fantasy, was Strange Grace by Tessa Gratton. It's not even what I put at the top of my ranking, because I don't think it's for everyone. Well, I do think everybody should read it, but it's just beautiful, and I've talked about it a lot. If my camera wasn't dying, I would wax poetic about it for another 10 minutes here. But I just think it's beautiful. I think it tells a huge story of love, both platonic and romantic. I think it tells about the persistence of humankind. I think it tells about not trusting everything you think you know, about how history lies, about how those in power have incentives to keep those under them under misunderstandings. I just really loved it, so much so that I literally have already bought another Tessa Gratton book, Night Shine, and will probably be starting it very soon. And I just want to read everything Tessa Gratton has ever written because I loved that single book so much that it would take a lot for her to let me down. So those are my favorites. Please let me know below some of your favorite or least favorite books that you've read in 2020. Hopefully, you know, if you've read any of these, let me know what you thought, especially those ones at the beginning, my least favorites. If you like any of those, please let me know why, other than The Inheritance Cycle. I know why people like The Inheritance Cycle, I just don't. Anyway, and I think this is it for my 2020 videos. Happy New Year, and bye.